This is Hannibal here from the HannibalTV.com, and Dave Meltzer did an extensive report on Ole Anderson's career in this week's Wrestling Observer. It was too extensive to put in my Wrestling Observer review. Obviously, there's a lot that I don't put in the review, so I encourage people to get it themselves that are interested. But I'm going to go over his report because Anderson was an important figure in wrestling overall. So he was born Alan Robert Rogowski, September 22nd, 1942, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, died at 81. He had been in hospice care for a while, suffering from dementia. His exact cause of death has not yet been released. He booked Georgia for Jim Barnett various times, starting in 1976. And he actually ran the company as general manager after he ended up firing Jim Barnett and threatening to charge him as he had been running the company and embezzling the company. So he basically had to tell him to leave, forcibly leave the company. Then Barnett ended up going to work for WWE. The company was sold out from under him in 1984 in a deal put together by Jack and Jerry Briscoe, who rounded up enough stockholders to where they had the majority. So that was famously actually ended up giving Gerald Briscoe his job for almost life in WWE, but Briscoe himself eventually ended up getting fired from WWE. And amazingly, his son Wes, who I've wrestled a lot and I actually like Wes a lot, used him a lot in Great North Wrestling, was never able to get. He was in Florida Championship Wrestling, but Briscoe never had enough pull to get his son on the main roster, which is bullshit, in my opinion, with all he did for McMahon over the years. And there's like Wes may not have been the next Hulk Hogan, but he was a solid hand. There's a lot worse than him out there. And he had a good look. Had some success in TNA, but I'm not going to digress too much. Anderson ended up giving the fans back Georgia Championship Wrestling because people did not like the WWF show. They called it Championship Wrestling from Georgia. Anderson ran it for a year. It folded after Jim Crockett Jr. bought the other time slot from the McMahons in 1985. Anderson then went back to work as a wrestler for Crockett, was an original member of the Four Horsemen, along with Ric Flair, Tully Blanchard, and Arn Anderson, who was originally billed as Ole's cousin or nephew. Ric Flair at one point was also billed as a relative of Ole Anderson. Anderson was best known for his 85 to 87 runs as one of the Four Horsemen nationally and internationally. I know him best from his shoot interviews and people talking about him because that was before my time. Uh, he didn't talk fondly about that period of time in his autobiography, which I guess I'm gonna have to read. Someone should put it on Audible. He always preferred, I guess, in his autobiography, talking about his days teaming with Gene Anderson as the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. He was known for being a critic of the next generation of wrestlers, claiming almost all of them were the shits. He was very proud about firing Hulk Hogan from Georgia because he said he wasn't any good. He claimed every gym in America has guys like Hogan. He also claimed Randy Savage had no talent and would usually downgrade Ric Flair. He sometimes admitted that Flair had talent, but he said him and Gene were responsible for Flair first becoming a star as they brought him in as their cousin. True. When Ole and Gene were in the Carolinas, the company ran multiple shows per night. Anderson would tell the other wrestlers that Flair was a performer and entertainer, and people would pay to see regularly because he did routines. He thought that he didn't do a routine, and his wrestling was more realistic as far as Ole's style. Of course, there's no doubt Flair had his routine, but it was over. And now everything just looks like acrobatics and totally set up. And I'll just say this, you guys can, I mean, Will Ospreay, he's a great acrobat. A lot of people like him, but none of the moves that he does do not look believable to me. They don't look like something you'd see in a real fight. But I won't digress. Um, Anderson used to claim that Flair, the consensus of being the biggest drawing card of Crockett Promotions ever had, was killing territory because all of his matches were the same. And Anderson wanted Flair out. The only way to get him out was to make him world champion. And of course, that is a ridiculous thing to say. Flair was voted the world champion by the then NWA Board of Directors in 1981 when they replaced Harley Race and wanted a long-term champion. They ended up revolving title around. They were going to revolve it around Dusty Rhodes, Flair, and DiBiase. They never ended up making DiBiase a world champion. I honestly don't know if Ted DiBiase is a good worker. I've seen his earlier stuff. His best work and most entertaining by far was when he was $1 Million Man, in my opinion. He may have been a good hand before, but his other personality is just Ted DiBiase was crazy boring. I don't think he would have made a good world champion. The whole WWE gimmick and Virgil, who I am going to do a report on his death after. I'll review Meltzer's report on Virgil. But like it all helped get $1 Million Man over. It ended up being that Rhodes was the short-term champion, and Flair ended up being the long-term champion. Flair beat Rhodes for the title. DiBiase was next in line, but Flair did so well that there was no DiBiase title run. Barnett apparently told Meltzer when Meltzer asked him why DiBiase didn't get his planned run. Um, and he said, if you were the promoter, if you had the choice between Flair and DiBiase, who would you pick? Flair ultimately held the title for a few months before losing to Race. And the rematch was very well drawing. It set up the first Starrcade event, Thanksgiving night, 83, where Flair regained the title and dominated the title for the rest of the 80s, back when it meant something. I don't even know who the current NWA champion is now. It's beyond meaningless. Anderson retired in 1987 after turning babyface in a losing feud with Tully Blanchard because at this point in time he had made a lot of money. He also owned a sawmill and he wanted to be closer to his son Bryant, who was a pretty good amateur wrestler and eventually went into pro wrestling as Bryant Anderson. I used to work in a sawmill in Cochrane, Alberta, by the way, and I freaking hated it. It was one of the worst jobs I ever had. When Lex Luger replaced Anderson in the Four Horsemen, Anderson was kicked out. Or sorry, and Luger was kicked out. He ended up teaming with Luger later on against Blanchard and Arn Anderson. He returned in '89 to form the Four Horsemen with Flair, Arn Anderson, and Sting. He was only there to set up the Horseman heel turn on Sting, which would lead to Sting beating Flair for the world title. That title ended up, the title win ended up being delayed for a few months due to Sting tearing his ACL. Anderson fully retired in 1990 due to injuries while in a feud over the NWA World Tag Team Championships where he and Arn were battling Rick and Scott Steiner. I have no recollection of that feud. Anderson remained in WCW for the next few years as a booker. His biggest angle was the Black Scorpion angle, and boy, his voice will never be forgotten as the Black Scorpion. Honestly, I love that Black Scorpion voice. I honestly think that gimmick could have worked if they'd done it properly. And it wasn't Ole Anderson's voice that killed the Shockmaster when it later did the Shockmaster either. It was the horrible outfit and let's be honest, Tugboats was a very basic wrestler with limited mic skills. Apparently the Black Scorpion angle just nobody knew what to do with it. It was played by a bunch of different men under a mask, including my good friend Wild Bill Irwin, who was stupid enough to do a shoot interview with me completely wasted. Al Perez and the Angel of Death, Dave Sheldon. By the way, I really like Al Perez. I like Al Perez about as much as I'd like to fucking beat up Bill Irwin. Um, the match, the match is didn't draw at house shows with these guys against Sting. And by the way, Perez jobbed to Sting on all of these house shows. The only one that he didn't job on was in um, St. Petersburg because Dusty Rhodes had been fired and he was going back to work for Florida Championship Wrestling and he didn't want to lose. Anderson was replaced as Booker and ended up working as a trainer. And apparently, he also worked as a troubleshooting Law and Order big match referee when Bill Watts was involved with the company. He also was briefly in control of WCW between Bill Watts and Eric Bischoff, which apparently Bill Watts liked to piss off the balcony of the CNN tower and bring a gun into the WCW corporate offices. He ended up working in the power plant, training wrestlers, but he was fired by Eric Bischoff shortly after Bischoff fired his son Bryant. Anderson then called Jim Cornette, who was running Smoky Mountain Wrestling, to get his son a job after Bischoff had fired him. Anderson invited Cornette to WCW grounds, and Bischoff hated Cornette, so fired him for doing so. Anderson never worked in pro wrestling again. And honestly, that might seem petty to bit about Bischoff, but try that with any job. Like if there's a guy that has a lot of heat, like for instance, in my job where I work for the city of Ottawa, yes, I do work a regular job. If there's a worker that has a lot of heat and like let's say gets trespassed from work, gets trespassed from the grounds, you could not bring the guy back there or you would be fired too. So if someone at Burger King that gets a lot of heat, if an employee brings them back, the manager's very likely gonna maybe not fire you, but get you in shit. So I don't think that that's that's not exactly petty. I don't think that's petty at all. You should be smart. Ole Anderson claimed he had 173 IQ. Why would you bring a guy hated by the office? And let's face it, Cornette is an asshole, lies a lot, and is a true scumbag. Real piece of crap of a human being. Uh, Bringing some guy like that to the grounds owned by a company when the company hates them. You deserve to get fired over that. Obviously, he was rich. He didn't care. Ole Anderson's booking did not help WCW. His heart didn't seem to be into it. Um, People liked and hated him. Dave Meltzer goes on to say, one major star of WCW went into detail of their thoughts on Ole Anderson during that period, with the benefit of hindsight. So this major star says, quote, I see online many people giving their condolences to Ole Anderson. Ole had very little respect for talent as management. He had the mindset that everybody was replaceable and there was a cheaper version of talent out there. His philosophy on taking green talent and making them into stars worked with the Road Warriors at the tail end of Georgia Championship Wrestling. At the same time, he thought Roddy Piper, Tommy Rich, the Freebirds, and others were replaceable. Ole failed to grasp that they were young talent that were entertaining their primes and were bringing in totally new audiences for WTBS. So I don't know. He's put a lot of quotes here, but he doesn't. But Meltzer doesn't say who they are. So without, he's put a lot of quotes. So he did get Tommy Rich over. I will give him that. I'm not going to go into all these quotes that Dave Meltzer put because I don't see who they're from. I really don't see who they're from. And I do see one thing as a guy that has promoted from a business standpoint. The more expensive guy, if a company's losing a lot of money, at some point, just totally cut costs and use guys that aren't going to cost a fortune. And yes, Tommy Rich was replaceable. Everybody is replaceable. WWE's proven that. It's just a fact. I mean, even Steve Austin was replaceable. Even Hulk Hogan was replaceable. And I know Ole Anderson was an asshole overall. He definitely was an asshole, but everybody is replaceable in wrestling. Okay, so let's go past the quotes here. Meltzer goes on to say there is no question that in the late 70s in Georgia, Anderson was an excellent booker. The Andersons versus Mr. Wrestling 1 and 2 was the best drawing feud in Atlanta in 76 and 77. His original February through April 1979 feud with Dusty Rhodes after a parking lot attack and their memorable Rhodes tagline, "It will never be over," led to a huge 4-month period where Rhodes and various partners like Bill Watts, Wahoo McDaniel, Stan Hansen, Mad Dog Vachon, and Tommy Rich faced Anderson and Koloff. They drew some of the biggest houses ever in Atlanta and the rest of Georgia for singles and tag team matches. Anderson and Koloff were among the best working teams of the era, with Koloff's non-stop pace and Anderson's solid wrestling and brawling. Rhodes and Anderson had classic promos, including Rhodes giving Anderson the name Pigface. Would get fans to chant oink oink at him. When they did a blindfold match, Rhodes said he would have the advantage because if he couldn't see Anderson, he could smell him. That is funny. When Freddie Miller would interview Anderson and Koloff, fans would loudly chant, "We don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear it." And Anderson would scream, "Well, you're going to hear it." A few months after the Rhodes versus Anderson program ran its course, Anderson turned face. Anderson and Koloff had lost the tag titles to Rich and the Crusher on September 21st, 1979 at the Omni. Crusher was only in for a short time. On October 5th, 79, Anderson and Ernie Ladd beat Rich and Crusher for the titles. Anderson and Ladd split up 10 days later with Anderson turning babyface. 4 days later at the Omni, Anderson teamed with longtime babyface Bob Armstrong against Ladd and killer Carl Cox. On that Thanksgiving night show, they had 12,000 fans for the annual tag team tournament. And Anderson and Thunderbolt Patterson beat Ladd and Koloff in the main event. Anderson is a babyface, also teamed with Tommy Rich, but mostly with Lars Anderson, his fake brother, we had known from college, and was actually Gene Anderson's first partner in the Minnesota Wrecking Crew before Ole arrived in the territory. Rhodes returned July 6, 1980, and in his return was attacked by the latest version of the Assassins, Jody Hamilton and Roger Smith. Rhodes asked Anderson to be his partners, and the enemies teamed up for the first time before 12,000 fans, with Harley Race versus Tommy Rich on top. Then that built to a July 20th cage match with Rhodes and Anderson versus the Assassins for 13,000 fans. And again, Race and Rich were in the main event NWA title. Luthez with referee on top. It's sad that Tommy Rich only had such a short career as like an over person. He's still wrestling today. Didn't save his money well like a lot of us. Meltzer goes on to say, unlike today where they do a long tag team match and a turn as soon as the cage door shut, everyone attacked Rhodes. Rhodes took a horrible beating, and then all the babyfaces tried to climb to the top of the cage. Beating went on for several minutes, got incredible heat. It's a key part of the angle was that a third Anderson brother, Lars, was the babyface. Kept trying to save Rhodes. The angle to extent was copied when Rhodes tried to save a babyface Ric Flair in a cage, only to have Flair turn on him in an angle that set up the main event of the Starrcade 85 show. So it goes on and on and on about Anderson. I'm not gonna go through the whole career because honestly, it talks about some of the goes into a lot of detail on Anderson and Rhodes. They also talk about the power of the Superstation, TBS at the time, because the Briscoe brothers, when they were still involved, pushed Jim Barnett to expand outside of Georgia. Barnett didn't want to do it to piss off other promoters, but they eventually did it, and they started going to Ohio. The first show in Ohio of Rhodes versus Anderson in Columbus, city I've been to, drew 9,000 fans. By the way, no more Arnold Classic in Columbus. That sucks. They ended up doing regular tours in the Sheik's old territory of Michigan, Ohio, and West Virginia. They were drawing far better in those states in Georgia. The Sheik was furious that Barnett started running the territory because apparently he had bought it for $50,000 from Barnett in 1964. But the Sheik's promotion was pretty much dead at this point. He still felt he owned the territory, though. In 1982, the business had really fallen, and this is when Anderson got rid of Barnett. The company had lost a lot of money. Apparently, the Atlantic City Auditorium was a 5,000 seat building that they were running weekly, and it had been the number one profit place of the company. Uh, They would only run the Omni every month or two. That held 16,500. The Omni shows would really be loaded up, but with the city auditorium closing, they had to go to running the Omni every week. So obviously, that was quite expensive. Break even was 25,000, which is about 5,000 people paid. When the Omni was every Friday night, it was less special to have events in the Omni, and most weeks drew under 5,000. So the city that had been the biggest profit um, winner was now the biggest profit loser. The NWA champion was coming in less or less. Ole Anderson, as Booker, didn't feel he was worth the 10% of the gate they had to pay. Tried to give Harley Race less, um, claiming his Omni payoff would be better than most cities, but Race refused to get less than 10%. That actually does make sense. Because when you hear about Ric Flair wrestling at car dealerships and stuff when he was NWA champion in front of 400 people, I would rather have 10% of 5,000 people than 10% of 400 people. I'll be, most people would, but I guess some of them wouldn't do it like Race out of principle. Barnett was in charge of booking the world champion. He would fight with Anderson, who didn't want the world champion, um, and would use contenders that didn't do as well but were cheaper. But even when they would have loaded shows at this point in time with top talent, they would draw less than 4,000 and sometimes less than 3,000. The booking magic was gone, even for the traditional holiday shows. Barnett had brought in Roddy Piper to be a television sidekick of Gordon Soley in 81 while business was not good. TV ratings were still great. That's interesting. And again, this is pretty much a book on Oli. He goes into great detail, and a lot of this stuff is boring to me, so I'll stick to the basics. When Anderson, okay, hold on. Yeah. So when the company was not doing well and losing a lot of money, Barnett took out loans for Georgia Championship Wrestling from National Banks of Georgia and the Omni itself. And Barnett actually sold much of his stock in Georgia, Florida, and Knoxville territories to his college friend Jim Oakes, who had also been the money between Barnett's success in Australia. Barnett sold some of his stock to raise capital, and Bill Watts sold his stock in Georgia Championship Wrestling to Ole Anderson, which Barnett helped convince Watts to do, since Anderson was working there full time as a top heel and booking the territory, and Watts had other things to do, booking his own promotion, Mid South Wrestling. At this point, the stockholders were Paul Jones, not the 70s wrestling star, but the figurehead promoter of Atlanta. He had 22%. Barnett had 18%. Oates had 7%. Fred Ward of Columbus, Georgia had 15%. Jack Briscoe at 10%. Ole Anderson at 10%. Joe Briscoe at 9.5%. Ralph Fred Ward's son-in-law at 5%. And Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods at 2%. Ole Anderson, as a part owner, went into the books and found the company was in bad shape, over $300,000 in debt. The expansions had cost territory money, and Barnett had used the money for his $3,000 a month phone bills, gifts to people in various cities like commission members, politicians, television station owners, and arena owners, and legal bills. Well, you would have to think that back in those days it was a lot harder to communicate with people, but 3,000 a month in phone bills is crazy, especially considering inflation. Anderson called a secret meeting of stockholders, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, Ward, and Freed. On December 31st, 82, Anderson and Freed went to Barnett and threatened to beat Barnett up and to turn him into the police and get him charged with embezzlement if he didn't give up his position as president and chairman of Georgia Championship Wrestling. Barnett countered, saying he'd give up his controlling power to Anderson, but as a big player in the community, wanted to keep his title so publicly he could parade around as a major company president. Barnett said he would transfer voting power of his 18% and stock to Anderson. Anderson originally agreed to this, but Barnett later renounced that agreement. He agreed to give power to Anderson, but wanted a regular salary and monthly expense account, plus the ability to continue to give gifts, some bribes to important people. I honestly think that is a good plan, especially with how much TV advertisement costs and stuff to give gifts to important people, in my opinion. I mean, that's just part of the business, man. Anderson, Ward, and Freed said he could retain access to the books, use the photocopying machine, and keep his health insurance through the company, and would get comp tickets to every on these shows. So publicly, he could still play a part in being company president, but no salary. Barnett said he had been making 140,000 a year in salary, making him the highest paid person in the company. But Barnett would get no expense account and no reimbursement for gifts. They offered him 6,200 for gifts he had purchased in 1982, and that was it. Or else they would turn him in for embezzlement. Barnett, who not only didn't want to fight legal charges and given his status and reputation in local high society, most importantly, didn't want it in the newspapers where all the other big movers or shakers would read he was being charged with embezzlement. So he took the deal. Even though he was out of power in Georgia, he was still booking the NWA champion, a job he did for free because it made him one of the most powerful people in the industry. He had done it since 1976 when the NWA owners wanted to save the 2.5% of the gate Sam Mushnick would take for booking the world champion. Disrespected Mushnick, the 1975 NWA convention, and caused him to quit as president. Because Barnett was gay, and for a time other promoters wouldn't even allow him to be an NWA member, but when his World Championship Wrestling promotion in Australia became the most successful company in the world, Mushnick pushed the other promoters to allow him in, which allowed the champion to get lucrative bookings in Australia. A few years later, Barnett left Australia and Eddie Graham maneuvered Barnett into running Georgia Championship Wrestling since the company was in a major promotional war with Ann Gunkel's All South Wrestling, and Barnett was considered the master of dirty tricks and political connections that ended up finishing off Gunkel's group, as well as stiffing attempts at oppositions from former football college star Jim Wilson and popular babyface Thunderbolt Patterson. Barnett was given power of NWA president as the booker of the world champion, but did it for no money. Because he was gay, his title was still secretary of the NWA. After being kicked out of Georgia Championship Wrestling, Barnett sold his 18% to Oates for $180,000 in June 1983. With Jim Crockett's top star Ric Flair being world champion by the end of the year, Crockett took over booking the champion, which was more meant for the other companies to get fewer and fewer dates, as Crockett wanted Flair for all the big shows. In later years, Barnett was hired by Vince McMahon as a COO of Titan Sports. Vince's own sense of humor was such that in some corporate releases, the COO was named Jane E. Barnett. The moniker James E. Cornette for the manager was a knockoff of James E. Barnett, as Cornette's actual middle name was Mark. And we all know that Vince McMahon definitely has a gay side now. So who knows? It probably turned Vince McMahon on to name Jim Barnett. Jane E. Barnett, with all we know about Vince now. The end of 1983, Barnett, Vince McMahon Sr., and the current Vince McMahon all resigned from the NWA and started the most significant wrestling war in history. While this was going on, Ole Anderson discovered he helped create the most successful tag team in pro wrestling through his friend Eddie Sharkey in Minneapolis. He brought in Joe Laurinaitis and Road Warrior Hawk, gave them a gimmick from the Mad Max movie. They're both super green. He started off just with Animal, but he was super green. He needs to get some experience. So sent him to work for Crockett, where he worked for limbs, made no money, lost a lot of weight. He ended up quitting wrestling. Went back to being a bouncer at Grandma B's. This is where Mike Hegstrand, who was also trained by Sharkey, also worked. They sent Hegstrand to British Columbia, where he played a German Crusher von Haig, but he had no experience, made no money, and he hated it. So they both came home and thought wrestling was over. But then when Anderson went to Minnesota to talk to Sharkey, he was looking for new talent that would work cheap, that he could get over. And he started looking at Hegstrand and Laurinaitis. And then at first he thought they were the same person, and then he found out there was two of them. And they got the idea for the Road Warriors because while this was going on, Anderson had no tag team champion since Offensica left at the start of 1983. He went 6 months with no champions, which may sound weird today, but Anderson's booking didn't make sense at the time this was going on. On television, he talked about a fictitious tournament where Arn Anderson and Matt Bourne were at some point going to win, but Bourne got arrested in June, which made the local media, and he had to leave the area. Back before the internet, where it completely ruined a career, when it would just be in local news. On the next television, Hegstrand and Laurinaitis debuted wearing the National Tag Team Championships belts, though they never actually wrestled as a team. They showed up on June 11th, 1983, winning with a quick splash over Randy Barber and Joe Young. They would do quick squashes, throwing their opponents around like rag dolls, pressing people overhead. Bill Watts brought them up and came up with the idea for the Mohawks and face paint. And with their exposure on TBS, they were able to go just about anywhere and draw huge. And in my opinion, the greatest tag team of all time. So there you go. Ole played a big part in the Road Warriors. Even with the Road Warriors, the Georgia business had dropped 60% in revenue by 82. Anderson used cheaper talent and actually made a $20,000 profit with cheaper talent. So there you go. Sometimes it's better to use cheaper talent and get more profit. Um, Apparently, Jack Briscoe looked at the big picture, and with McMahon expanding using cheaper talent, Gates being down like that, he felt it was not a long-term success recipe. Jack and Jerry felt that the long term with Anderson in charge would end up with their stock worthless. By this point, Woods had sold his 2% to Gene Anderson. In early April, Jack and Jerry called Vince McMahon. He told them that he and his brother Jerry were going to get out of wrestling and were looking to sell their stock. McMahon realized that while he was expanding, He had shows on both MSG and US cable, but the highest rated cable show was still WTBS. The idea of getting that time slot would put him in a greater position as he controlled the national television. McMahon called the Briscoes for a secret meeting at LaGuardia Airport. McMahon made it clear he wasn't interested in buying 19% of the company. He wanted at least 51% or had no interest. The key value of the company was the TBS show that aired nationally and the contract to run events at the Omni. Because at that time, a lot of arenas, for people that don't know, and some arenas still have this, they have like monopolies where, like, back when WWE and WCW were having a war, some arenas would not allow one company or the other to go in there. One reason why WCW never went to MSG, and probably MSG probably still has that deal with WWE. That's the only reason I can figure out why AEW never ran there. I know Ring of Honor somehow got a show there, by far their biggest show ever, but I have no idea how they pulled that off. The Briscoes went to the elderly Jones, the stockholder, and said McMahon would pay him 220,000 in cash for his stocks. They gave Briscoe 41.5%. That gave Briscoe 41.5%. McMahon told Barnett about his plan, and then Barnett put him in touch with Oates. Oates first turned McMahon down. Jerry Briscoe then tried to talk to Oates into selling, as with his 26%, they would be able to sell McMahon 67.5%, enough for the deal to go through. Vince and Linda McMahon flew to Atlanta, had a secret meeting with the Briscoes and Jones on April 19th, 1984 at 10 p.m. that night with stockholders Gene and Ole Anderson, Fred Ward, having no idea of any of this. The Briscoes, Jones, and Oates used their majority voting power to add a bylaw that the company could be sold without informing any of the shareholders of the sale, nor allowing them the right to match the outside offer and keep the company. Once that was signed, they sold the stock to Big Fan. So that's a really dirty, underhanded thing to do. But that was the way the wrestling wars worked. Oates balked on selling, but the way of the land was he saw the stock would lose its value as the revenue fell. And while he was not fond of the Briscoes, Anderson, Ward, and Freed were the ones who got rid of Barnett, and he felt the only real asset to the company was the slot on TBS. When Anderson found out about the sale, he tried to get injunctions to block it, and the court case held up McMahon taking over Georgia Championship Wrestling until the famous Black Saturday, July 14th, 1984, when McMahon took over Georgia Championship Wrestling. He debuted his WWE show that would air Saturday and Sundays on TBS, which was the most watched time slot in the in the country. McMahon then closed down Georgia Championship Wrestling and offered several people jobs, although he didn't want any of them, and buried a few who ended up coming. Essentially turning Mr. Wrestling 2 into a jobber. It seems like that always happens, right? They did it again in WCW with most of the or in WWE when they bought WCW. Bring DDP in, make him a jobber. As much as I hate Buff Bagwell, I mean, they just destroyed his career. They would have been better building him a little bit and then jobbing him out to younger guys. But yeah, they have a thing. It happened with UWF when they were bought by Crockett's too. They just buried everyone other than Sting. Um, anyways, Vin McMahon had a strong national time slot for a year, but ratings were going down over the course of the year. Turner had wanted them to tape that show in Atlanta. McMahon talent schedule didn't allow that, so he just did tapes. There was no show taped in actual Atlanta. So Turner gave Willie Anderson a 7:30 a.m. Saturday morning time slot, which was good enough to start a new company and promote small events. Turner then put Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling show on the air in early '85, and it drew higher ratings than WWE. He and Watts made a deal to expand nationally together, but when McMahon found out he was going to be kicked off, he had Barnett contact Jim Crockett Jr. and offered him the time slot for 1 million. Crockett took it, and that was the end of McMahon on TBS. Now, to me, that's interesting that the whole reason why McMahon sold that to Crockett Jr. was because there may have been a collaboration with Ole Anderson's Georgia Championship Wrestling in Mid-South. And let's be honest, at this point in time, Mid-South was pretty damn good product. And maybe the combined minds of Ole Anderson and Bill Watts could have done better than Crockett, but that's not how it played out. Anderson held 38 different major promotions tag team championships between 69 and 86. 23 with Gene Anderson, but also his best in-ring partner was probably Ivan Koloff in Georgia. He also held titles with Ox Baker and the Claw, who was Tom Anderson in the Omaha, Nebraska circuit, and Ron Garvin in Florida, Thunderbolt Patterson, Ernie Ladd, Lars Anderson, Sergeant Jacques Goulet, Jerry Briscoe, Stan Hansen, and Arn Anderson were also tag team partners of him. He grew up in Minnesota as a high school wrestler and did some college wrestling at St. Cloud State University, where Larry Hennemy was one of the star wrestlers who ended up placing the NAIA Nationals and had an attempt to make the '64 Olympic team. When that didn't pan out, he started wrestling in the AWA. Now, I don't even know. Okay, so he's talking about Anderson here. So Anderson only wrestled in the NAIA. So for Canadian fans that don't know, there's Division 1, 2, and 3 in the NAIA. At one point, Simon Fraser University in Canada also competed in NAIA. I don't know if they still do or not. But for American fans, Canadian schools aren't allowed to give out athletic scholarships. And having Simon Fraser allowed to compete in the NAIA allowed them to give out scholarships. That was the one, I only know this because that's the one Canadian school that offered me a scholarship out of high school. But I ended up accepting one at University of Buffalo. But in the end, I didn't do it. Went into pro wrestling, but I'm not going to digress. So he had a pretty good wrestling career, amateur wrestling career, but then ended up going into the AWA. Apparently, I'm going to end it at that because he goes on and on. This is literally a book, and we've gone through the main stuff. I'll keep skimming through this, but I think that's about all I want to read about Ole Anderson. The most I was interested in is the Shockmaster and the Black Scorpion stuff. Let's see what you guys had to say. Put your thoughts of Ole Anderson in the comments. And that was longer than I thought it. Almost an hour, and I'm not even reading the whole thing. Let's get your comments. How's my movie going? Well, I had a very rough last year and a half. Due to some false accusations that were against me that I ended up overcoming and being completely cleared in court. And the person that made those actually is facing jail time. But that kind of delayed my movie and put me in a horrible mental state that led me to almost end my life. I almost lost all the blood. I cut my throat, sliced my abdomen open, sliced my liver in half. At one point, I was so depressed. And the legal battle cost me a lot. Plus, I was placed on forced leave from my regular job during that time. So it's been a recovery period, but now that that's over, I'll get back in shape and get back into the movie. But I also broke, strangely enough, um, I won't get into the story, but it's related to the suicide attempt. There was some construction going on in my house that caused me to basically shatter my heel. And then they had to put screws into my heel, and the screws got infected. Then I had to be on IV antibiotics for months. And the heel's still recovering. Had stem cell injections in it last week in New Jersey. I'm getting back. I'm walking with a cane now, but I don't have the cast on. But but to answer your question, Doosan, the movie's still gonna happen. I spent over 15 grand on it. It's still gonna happen. ATF media heard WWE on TBS didn't work because people refused to watch wrestling that didn't have hands of stone Ronnie Garvin. That could very well be true. And maybe that's why they hired him after they were kicked off TBS. Jack Kilby says Oli had tremendous promos, especially working as a heel. Extremely believable, rough and tumble character. Always one of my favorites. Rest in peace. And apparently Jack Kilby has a good Ole Anderson impression that I'm looking forward to hearing. The Goon, Wild Bill Irwin, yes, Al. And I suggest people check out my shoot interview with him. By the way, it's funny. Some people posted my shoot interview with him in a way of like insulting me. And then they complained to YouTube, which by the way, I paid for that shoot interview. And these other people posted it and they complained that I complained to YouTube about it. You can't just post other people's content and not ask them, and especially if you're using it in a negative way. Make your own content that's interesting. And why are you watching mine so much if you hate me so much? Oli is a legend. Yes, he is a legend. Phil really enjoyed Oli and Gordon together in Georgia Championship Wrestling. It was incredible and fearsome. Pennsylvania Beagle back in Georgia Championship Wrestling. Oli made a lot of people a lot of money. Yes, that is true. Well, say what you want about Meltzer. Nobody else is writing that, but and again, there's a lot I didn't read. I'm giving him credit that I'm reading that. I'm not saying I knew all this about his career. Eh, there's like a whole book on Oli. Somebody says to ATF Media, you may remember a video of Ronnie Garvin training for Jake Roberts to take on to the tune of John Cougar Mellencamp's "The Walls Come Tumbling Down." I'm gonna have to look that up. That was back in the days where people didn't pay royalty fees. Someone says Georgia Championship Wrestling with Gordon Soley was the best. Phil was part of a chat involving Ronnie. R.I.P. from Ronnie. Oh, you see, not everyone likes Ole Anderson. And Meltzer didn't get into his racism accusations. A lot of people were like, I mean, I'm not saying it's right. but I'm saying at the time people used the N, like this was just the time. A lot more recently, even like when I was growing up in the early 90s and 80s, you could people hated gay people. The most people did not like gay people. And if you acted gay or wore a pink shirt to school or even were somewhat like you would be beat up or made fun of. So it was just acceptable. Now it's not. Now the gay people are considered cool. So I'm just saying that in the time where Oli was using the N word, which I mean has been said by enough people, he clearly used it. It was more of a common thing. It wasn't like I highly doubt he'd be saying that openly to people today. I just highly doubt it. Um, and I don't know if he was how deep his racism was or not. He pushed a lot of black wrestlers. Um, you're never gonna see me using the N word. There's no tape of it that's ever gonna come out. I don't use it, um, and I definitely don't approve of it. But I'm just saying from his time. I mean, lots of people said Ric Flair used it a lot. We all know Ken Patera like uses it, but I really don't think Ken Patera is racist. He's just from a time when they used it and it was acceptable. And I'm definitely glad that it's not anymore. But again, Tito Santana was mad that he called him a Mexican, which I guess if you say, "Hey, Mexican, get over here," I mean, I guess that could be considered racist. But Oli was just an asshole. Let's face the facts here. I think somebody said it. Kevin Sullivan said it. Oli hated everyone equally. He hated every race equally. ATF media heard the Road Warriors Rick Rude, Kurt Hennig, Barry Darsow once joked about fighting Hands of Stone Ronnie Garvin, but knew he would knock out every one of them. Very true. Gordon Soley was the goat. Someone says remembers going to Cleveland Public Hall to watch Georgia Championship Wrestling. The Road Warriors beat the hell out of some bikers who threw a keychain at Hawk. The one guy's nose was by his ear. That's the other thing. Like the wrestlers today, I mean, there are some tough ones, but like you hear of Sami Zayn having like a guy kicked out of the crowd for hurting his feelings. Like I like the old days when you had guys like the Road Warriors that would like deal with actual fan attacks and kick the crap out of people. It's just like that magic is gone. Thank you for the $2 tip, Prince Almighty. Do I think Cody Rhodes will dethrone Roman Reigns? I hope not. It really depends if I think honestly, if The Rock and Roman Reigns are going to split up at some point, I could see it being better if Roman Reigns has the title against The Rock, but Cody Rhodes has been the workhorse for the company over the past year. He does have a lot of fans, and he is going on the road. So I don't know. I would say there's a 50-50 chance in that match, whereas I don't think whatever match The Rock has at WrestleMania this year is going to be his last match. I think The Rock is a shareholder in the company. It's to his benefit to appear more and build the company up so he makes more money. Hence his 3 appearances this month. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I would say a 50-50 chance. What do you think? Iron Man was perfect for the Road Warriors. Yes. Great song. I only knew it from the Road Warriors. I didn't even know Ozzy sang it at first. That was the first time I heard it. Anyways, guys, please like the video. Put your memories of Ole Anderson in the comments. Thanks for tuning in.